Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining ICNA CSJ as we discuss Guantanamo Bay. My name is Lena, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. Guantanamo Bay has been open for 19 years. At this time, there are 40 prisoners remaining in detention, and among these 40, 5 men are accused of planning and supporting the 9/11 attacks. Throughout the history of Guantanamo Bay, the use of torture, rendition, and indefinite detention without charge or trial has been consistent. Today, we'll have 3 professionals speaking on this issue. Please also feel free to use the chat to ask any questions. First, we have Matt Hawthorne. He is the policy director at the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, and he'll be outlining the current situation at Guantanamo Bay and talking about the history that has led us to this point. Matt, please go ahead.
Thanks, Lena. So I thought I would, as Lena said, start with the current situation, say a few words about the history, and then talk about where we expect the Biden administration to come down on the issue and what we can do to advocate for them to close Guantanamo and end indefinite detention there. As Lena said, there are 40 detainees in Guantanamo. That is of 780 that were there originally during the Bush administration. 15 of them are in some stage of the military commissions process, including 3 that the Pentagon just sent charges up for on January 21st, which we suspect may have been an attempt by someone there to sort of jam the Biden administration on the issue. As probably many of you know, the military commissions are essentially a poor substitute for ordinary U.S. courts. They were designed initially to be unfair, and that has been litigated, and they have been reformed numerous times over the years. And yet they have still at this point failed to begin trial for most of the people who have been charged in it, including the 5 9/11 defendants now more than 19 years after the 9/11 attacks. And I'm told by the lawyers for those detainees that they will not begin trial this year either. So it's going to be at least 2 decades after the attacks before the people suspected of planning in those attacks are tried, which is obviously not just to them or to the victims and the victims' families. There are also 6 people in Guantanamo who have been cleared to leave Guantanamo to be transferred to other countries, with appropriate security arrangements and agreements with those countries. 5 of them have been cleared for more than 4 years at this point, but the Trump administration did not move forward with transferring them. And then there's 19 others there who are basically just being held indefinitely without charge, without trial, all for well over a decade at this point. And that's just, at this point, there's no plan in place for either charging or moving those people out. Obviously, my organization feels that holding people without trial on a military base in a foreign country is wrong. It also has significant reputational costs for the U.S. It has been used as a justification for human rights abuses by regimes and non-state actors around the world. They point to the Guantanamo as a place where the U.S. tortured people, as a place where the U.S. holds people without trial. And rhetorically, it then is used to justify similar actions. And then finally, it's also very expensive. It costs over $13 million per prisoner per year to hold people in Guantanamo. And if you multiply that by 40, the 40 people who are there, that's over $500 million per year just to hold those 40 people, which on a per prisoner basis makes it easily the most expensive prison in the world. So just say a few words now about the history of how we got here. After the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration essentially wanted a place where they could hold suspected terrorists, where they had complete control, but where they intended it to be outside of the reach of U.S. law. And Guantanamo had actually been used for a somewhat similar purpose in the previous Bush and the Clinton administrations, when they had both sent Haitian refugees there, and in the Clinton administration, Cuban refugees also, as an attempt to essentially hold refugees without giving them access to the U.S. So the Bush administration got the idea from them. Many of the detainees who were sent to Guantanamo were tortured there through the use of things like sexual harassment, threats with dogs, stress positions, extreme temperatures, sleep deprivation, forced shaving, and abuse of the Quran. Also, several of the detainees in Guantanamo, including some who are still there, initially were sent, before they were sent to Guantanamo, to CIA black sites, secret CIA sites in various countries around the world, where they were also tortured with things like repeated waterboarding, sometimes to the point of inducing convulsions, forced rectal feedings, threats to family members, and similar torture. By the end of the Bush administration, it had become increasingly clear, even to people in the Bush administration, that torture was not an effective way of gathering intelligence. And between that and attempts by Congress, led by Senator McCain, to restrict the use of torture and to end it, the amount of the types of torture and the amount of torture had dramatically decreased. And then when President Obama came in, he ended the torture program. Later in 2015, Senator McCain and Senator Feinstein led the Senate to passing a bipartisan piece of legislation that required that all interrogations follow the guidelines in the Army Field Manual on Human Intelligence Collector Operations. And essentially what that did was ban torture. The Field Manual is not perfect, but it's basically a humane standard for interrogations that both the CIA and the military are now required by that law to follow. And that law is what prevented the Trump administration from resuming the use of torture, despite President Trump's repeated promises to do so. So that's, and then during the history or during the 2016 campaign, President Trump promised he would fill Guantanamo up, load Guantanamo up, as he called it, with what he called bad dudes. We were quite concerned that he would transfer ISIS prisoners there. Ultimately, though, his administration concluded that because it was so expensive to hold people there, and because the military commission system had so badly failed to achieve justice, in his interpretation of justice, it had failed to convict people. Obviously, justice would also have the possibility of not convicting them, finding them not guilty. But in any case, because it had failed to do that, he did not end up sending ISIS detainees there. And so we went through his administration without him adding anyone to the population at Guantanamo. Now, under President Biden, President Biden has, throughout his career, consistently opposed torture, and he has also said during his campaign and during the Obama administration also supported closing Guantanamo. And there's a widespread belief, I think, among the people who work on this issue that he's serious, that he thinks Guantanamo should be closed, and that he's truthful about believing that holding people there without trial is bad for the country. What's less clear, though, is to what extent he's willing to pay a political price to close Guantanamo and end indefinite detention, and to what degree he is willing to push the envelope on executive powers in order to close the prison there. To close the prison and to end indefinite detention at Guantanamo, he will have to take a number of steps. He'll have to first forge diplomatic agreements with foreign countries to accept people who are been cleared to leave Guantanamo. And that should start with the 6 who are already cleared. He will, and that's something that's quite doable. The Obama administration did that with hundreds of people, 100 plus people. And then after that, he will have to also ensure that the process for clearing detainees moves more quickly than it has under the Trump administration. During President Trump's tenure, it took 4 years to clear one detainee. So obviously that pace needs to move a lot faster. Thirdly, he's going to have to arrange for his Department of Justice is going to have to forge plea agreements with as many detainees as possible. And with plea agreements, then detainees can be transferred out, basically according to those agreements, to third countries, which gets in place gets around some restrictions on transfers that Congress has put in place. And I'm told by detainee lawyers that many of the detainees would agree to plea agreements at this point. So that's a third way he can get people out. And then fourthly, there's going to be, after doing those things, there's going to be a small number of detainees, maybe just the 9/11 defendants, but in any case, a small number who are realistically not going to be transferred to third countries, And the way out for those people is going to be for them to be tried or to agree to plea agreements in federal courts, and then to be transferred to, and then either found not guilty, or if found guilty, be transferred to be imprisoned in U.S. prisons. Unfortunately, Congress has made all those steps more difficult by putting in place restrictions on transferring people to the U.S. and by putting in place an onerous approval process for approving transfers to third countries. However, Representative Adam Smith, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, has tried now for the last couple of years to remove many of those restrictions, and in particular, the restrictions on transferring detainees to the U.S. So the most important thing we can do as advocates at this point to enable Guantanamo to be closed and to end indefinite detention there is first to support that effort. NERCAT has been, of course, lobbying members of Congress to work with Adam Smith to lift the restrictions on transferring detainees. But we have also been encouraging people to contact their own members of Congress by email, by phone calls, or better yet, by actually asking to meet with them. These days, of course, by video, but in any case, to meet with the member themselves to talk about the importance of closing Guantanamo and the importance of removing the restrictions on transferring detainees out. Secondly, the other thing that we can do is advocate in public forums for closing Guantanamo, and that can be letters to the editor, op-eds, blog posts, speeches, rallies, vigils, that sort of thing. They all help. And the reason that they help and the reason they matter is fundamentally, the politics of closing Guantanamo are always going to be difficult. Unfortunately, well, it's not true in many cases. There is a perception by the public that the people there are terrorists, and terrorists are unpopular. The good news, though, is that there is really no one left who is advocating for Guantanamo to remain open. There are people advocating for it to be closed, but there's no one on the other side. There's no one pushing that direction. And so to the extent that there's people advocating in public to close Guantanamo, and to the extent that people in the administration, members of Congress, congressional staff, President Biden see people advocating to close Guantanamo, that helps them believe that it is politically possible to do so, and makes a real difference in the politics of them doing that. So again, those two steps, contacting members of Congress and finding any public forums available to advocate for closing Guantanamo are crucial to seeing that happen. I think I'll end there, although I think there's going to be questions at the end. I will then move. I'm going to talk now just for a few seconds about this film that's going to come out shortly called The Mauritanian. This film is about a former Guantanamo detainee named Mohamedou Ould Slahi. And he was suspected of being involved in attacks around the millennium, or planned attacks around the millennium. Ultimately, this was never shown to be true, but because of the suspicion that he was involved in that, and because he had been involved with Al Qaeda in the early 1990s, when fighting against the communist regime in Afghanistan at that point, a time when the U.S. was supportive of that fight. He ended up facing suspicion from the U.S. and a number of countries, was tortured, is ultimately sent to Guantanamo, stayed there through 2016, including 6 years after a federal judge had ordered that he be allowed to leave. And The Mauritanian is a film essentially about his story, which is quite compelling and will be coming out in theaters on February 12th. And I'm not yet been told about the plan for releasing it on streaming. I know many of you may not be going to theaters now, but we'll play the trailer, and I encourage you to watch it either in the theaters or if you're social distancing more than that, then please consider watching it when it does come out on a streaming service. Ramiz, can we play the trailer now?
I've never been part of a conspiracy, but I'm starting to think this is what it must feel like to be on the outside of one.
If you stray outside the designated areas, you will be removed from the island.
It's recommended you wear a hijab when visiting your client. We've had incidents of inmates spitting at female lawyers.
You want to represent the head recruiter for 9/11.
Mohamedou Ould Slahi, the Mauritanian held in Guantanamo. He recruited the guys who flew your friend's plane into the South Tower.
He
He put those men on my husband's plane?
I'm gonna make him pay.
In the event the detainee lunges for you, push back away from the table. We're getting there as quick as we can.
I'm Nancy Hollander. This is my associate. We wish to represent you.
We are seeking the death penalty, but if we miss something, this guy goes home. Let's get to it.
Call this number. Speak to my mother. Tell her, I don't know, something nice.
The U.S. government is holding upwards of 700 prisoners in Guantanamo. Since when did we start locking people up without a trial in this country?
That's a lot of case files.
The prosecution won't show us the evidence they have against you. It's all redacted.
You get a problem, take it up with the government.
All my time here, I've been told you are guilty. Not for something that I have done, but because of suspicions and associations. I am innocent.
He has been interrogated. He has been held against his will for 6 years without a single charge being laid against him.
Doesn't it bother you at all working for someone like this?
I'm not just defending him. I'm defending the rule of law.
You haven't seen what I've seen.
Where I'm from, in Mauritania, we know not to trust the police. But never did I believe that the United States of America would use fear and terror to control me.
A couple sleepless nights, that's all.
I've never been part of a conspiracy, but I'm starting to think this is what it must feel like to be on the outside of it.
You're overthinking this. Either wear the jersey or get off the field.
You need to tell me what happened to you. I can't defend you. Do you understand that?
You asked me to set fire to this place, but I'm still sitting.
Maybe he's guilty.
Maybe he is. We're doing our job.
I'm not welcome home. That's not a part of my job.
If I'm wrong, when it comes to my reckoning, I'm the one that'll have to answer for it.
What makes you think you're any better than the rest of us?
I don't think I'm better than anybody else. That is the point.
For 8 years, I have been dreaming of being in a courtroom. Now that I'm here, I'm scared to death.
You know, I think I figured out why they built Guantanamo down there. My client, he's not a suspect. He's a witness.
Mr. Slahi, would you please raise your right hand and repeat after me?
The Mauritanian.
Great. Thanks, Ramiz. And I think, Lena, I'll turn it over to you now to introduce Kathy.
Thank you, Matt, for that concise description and for introducing that trailer as well. Our next speaker is Kathy Manley, who is a legal director with the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. She'll be speaking on the legal landscape of Guantanamo Bay, as well as the secrecy involved with the proceedings. Kathy, go ahead.
Thanks, Lena, and thanks, Matt. And I can't wait to see the movie. I've worked with Nancy Hollander, and she's wonderful. It looks like a great movie, kind of difficult to watch maybe, but anyway. So 19 years ago, under George W. Bush, hundreds of mostly innocent Muslims were kidnapped and abused and stuck in this legal black hole in Guantanamo in a deliberate attempt to completely avoid the rule of law. Some of them could have been charged with crimes, or some could have been held as POWs under the Geneva Convention. Instead, all the laws were ignored and they were tortured and held indefinitely without charges. A total of, 780 people have been held there. 8 have died there so far. They were said to be the worst of the worst. And the government knew fairly soon that the majority of them were innocent. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, aide to Secretary of State, then Secretary of State Colin Powell, said in 2010 that Bush, Cheney, and Rumsfeld, among others, knew that the majority of the detainees were innocent, but they allowed it to go on. So who is the worst of the worst here? The courts have done very little. There have been 4 Supreme Court decisions that in various ways said that the government couldn't completely ignore the law by putting people on this island. In 2004, there were 2 cases, but they didn't really reach the constitutional issues, except for the very few people there that were American citizens. In 2006, in the Hamdan case, the Supreme Court said that the Geneva Convention applied, but I would say that that decision hasn't really been enforced properly. In 2008, in the Boumediene case, the court said that the Military Commissions Act was unconstitutional and that there was a constitutional right to file habeas petitions. But I don't think anyone has been released due directly to a court decision. There have been several good lower court decisions, but many of them were reversed on appeal by the DC Circuit. Whenever it looked like someone might be ordered released, the government tended to release them first so they wouldn't get a negative court decision. And since the Boumediene case in 2008, the DC Circuit, where these cases end up, hasn't really been following what the Supreme Court said. And the Supreme Court hasn't done anything about it. So the courts haven't really done much at all to put a stop to this. Many detainees were released under Bush. There were 245 left when Obama came to power in 2009 and vowed to close the prison. He continued repatriating people, and he tried to close it, but he didn't try hard enough. Congress insanely said that no one from Guantanamo could be brought to the US, even to a prison. But one of Obama's biggest mistakes, I think, was his decision not to prosecute anyone for what was clearly torture, as well as illegal indefinite detention. And of course, that illegal indefinite detention is continuing. And Obama also agreed with the proposition that there were 30 detainees at that time who couldn't be tried, largely because the evidence against them had come from torture, but that they were supposedly too dangerous to release. That is not the rule of law. When Trump came to power, there were 41 detainees left, and only one, as Matt mentioned, was released in the last 4 years. And also, as Matt said, of the 40 that are there now, 6 are cleared for release but aren't being released. The majority, I think 22, are still said to be too dangerous to release but are never going to be tried. 2 have been convicted in the military commissions. Majid Khan pled guilty after having been held in black sites and tortured for years. The other person, Ali Hamza al-Balul, was convicted in 2008, but all but one of his convictions were overturned on appeal. But I think he's still sentenced to life on his remaining conspiracy conviction. 3 others, I think, are proposed for a military commission trial, but have never been charged after 14 years of detention. And 7, as Matt mentioned, are currently charged in the military commission process. And that process is kind of ridiculous. It never seems to move forward. The prosecution keeps spying on the defense, putting recording devices in many different places, including in the courtroom at one point. And they've sent spies to infiltrate the defense teams. Who knows if this case will ever actually reach trial? None of this comports in any way with the Constitution or the rule of law. The torture and indefinite detention, often in solitary confinement, is the worst part of this. But the secrecy is another very dangerous and insane part of it. When I was part of a conference with some Guantanamo defense lawyers a few years ago, they said that at that time, they were not allowed to read the New York Times because it reported on leaked classified evidence. They had security clearances, but they could not read the New York Times. I think that changed eventually, although it may have changed back for all I know. The rules keep changing. It's not the rule of law. When they meet with their clients, they take notes, but then have to give them to the military, who goes through them for months before eventually releasing them. I can't even imagine representing a client under those kind of conditions without even considering the trip to Guantanamo and what you have to go through. They're doing great work. And one of the generals in charge of the defense even was locked up briefly for refusing to compromise the defense. But it's an impossible situation for them. Finally, I would say that the very existence of this legal black hole where people can be detained for years without charges under horrendous conditions, where people can be tortured and even killed with no consequences, where the prosecution can spy on the defense with no consequences, the fact that all of this goes on with no consequences, it can't help but have a major corrosive effect on the law in domestic cases. There's many ways in which that happens. One is just the idea, usually unspoken, that if you were treated harshly or subjected to prolonged solitary confinement, it can't be all that bad because it's not as bad as Guantanamo. Or if, as happened in my case and many others, my case where I represented Yassin Araf, if the trial attorney for the defense doesn't get the classified evidence given to the judge, which resulted in a lot of bad effects, even though the trial attorney had a security clearance, well, that must be okay because it's not as bad as what happens in Guantanamo. If people get sentenced to 30 years or even life in an unfair sting operation, well, it must be okay because at least they got a fair trial, supposedly, except that the trials are not fair. In the same way that Islamophobia and post 9/11 fear allowed for the existence of Guantanamo and kept the public from caring very much, that same Islamophobia and fear has allowed for unfair prosecutions in domestic federal courts. My colleagues in the Coalition for Civil Freedoms and I studied all 600 of the cases which the Department of Justice called terrorism convictions between 2001 and 2015. And we, partnering with ICNA Social Justice, thank you, published a report in 2019 called Inventing Terrorists. And if you want to see it, you can Google Inventing Terrorists. It should come up on the ICNA site and you can download it there. In that report, we found that of the 600 cases, only a very small handful were actual terrorists. There were 15 who were involved in an actual or attempted attack in the US, and another 18 who did the same thing overseas. 70% of the 600 cases are what we call purely preemptive prosecution. That means that nothing we would consider an actual crime took place. The idea of preemptive prosecution comes from the FBI deciding after 9/11 that it had to prevent another attack, even if it meant locking up a lot of innocent Muslims. Dick Cheney said that if there's a 1% chance that this person might attack us in the future, we have to stop them now. And that seems to be the FBI's playbook. And 93% of the 600 convictions were either completely preemptive or had what we call elements of preemptive prosecution. And these cases included many unfair sting operations where vulnerable people, often mentally ill, were incited or coaxed by FBI informants to say bad things on tape. And many of them got life sentences. And there's one example that I wanted to mention that relates directly to Guantanamo, and that's the case of Uzair Paracha. His father, Saifullah Paracha, is one of the Guantanamo detainees. Uzair was basically, it was guilt by association. He was arrested in 2003, and then he was convicted in domestic court of material support to terrorism in 2008. He was convicted entirely on evidence derived from the torture of 3 Guantanamo detainees, Majid Khan, Ammar al-Baluchi, and Khalid Mohammed. Uzair was sentenced to 30 years. But he's one of the lucky ones, because after it was shown clearly that the torture had occurred, the 3 detainees submitted new statements saying that Uzair was innocent and that he had only made the previous statements under torture. Uzair was granted a new trial in 2018, and finally he was released last March and returned to Pakistan a free man. Of course, he was locked up for 17 years, but he's one of the lucky ones because he got out and he doesn't have any conviction. In addition to the 40 people still in Guantanamo, there are over 200 Muslims unfairly held in these cases in federal custody. We are trying to change this, but there's this impression that because it's not as bad as Guantanamo, it's okay. Biden needs to do everything he can to close Guantanamo, and there needs to be reparations for the people unfairly held there, and some consequences so that we can hopefully start to follow the Constitution and the rule of law in all cases, and not have an exception for Muslims or any group who may be unpopular at any given time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. That was a really concise description of the legality behind Guantanamo Bay. Next, we'll have Ron Stief, who is the Executive Director of the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. He'll speak on how the U.S. faith community has kept the issue of Guantanamo Bay alive throughout the time it's been open. Ron, please go ahead.
Thanks, Lena, and welcome everybody. The chat is active. I see a lot of familiar faces there. We are a movement, and so I do want to talk a little bit about how the faith community has kept this issue alive. I came to the National Religious Campaign Against Torture as the executive director right when the first Obama term was ending. And of course, as we mentioned, President Obama had pledged to close Guantanamo. And I frankly did not think that I would be sitting here in 2021 continuing to advocate for the closure. I know we had some tough fights with Congress. I know President Obama didn't go far enough, and I know that President Trump didn't listen to any of the economic arguments or anything that we had to say about closing Guantanamo. And you wonder what's going to kick this loose. And I think what's kept it alive as an issue to the point where it is again a priority for the current president and his administration, President Biden. I think what's kept it a priority in large part is the moral mandate and the moral pressure that the religious community and the human rights community has really kept on the nation, really on the conscience of the nation, to close Guantanamo prison. The shared values we have in the religious community, because it is a site that not only was there horrible torture there, as we described, but it stands as a symbol of the U.S. support for torture. So even though it was banned by President Obama when he came in and was not reinstituted by President Trump, CIA torture was not instituted. Torture at Guantanamo was not instituted, although you can call into question some of the current practices as torture if you want, but not the kind that we think of as depicted in the movie. Even though that's all been banned and somewhat, I think our society has realized that we don't want to return to a society that tortures. This symbol where we tortured people and where 40 people still remain in cells, indefinitely detained, is still there. And so the faith community has, I think it's the one thing we all agree on. This is an interfaith group here. I see Rabbi Joshua, Sister Lobianco. I see Christians, Muslim, Jews in the audience. We all agree that torture is an abomination in God's sight, in Allah's sight, in Yahweh's sight. That it's an abomination. It's the stripping of another human being of their God-given dignity. And so here we are as the United States thinking we're some exceptional nation, that, you know, we are the beacon for liberty, the beacon for freedom, the beacon for sometimes human rights, although that's fallen by the wayside with the last administration. But that's something that I think we're trying to restore. And yet, how can anyone take us seriously when a place like Guantanamo continues to sit as it does, unresolved, with no end in sight? So I think the role of the faith community is to continue to press this as a moral issue. The lawyers have their obligations, the politicians have their obligation, and we have our obligation. I'm reminded of something that Nelson Mandela said. I think it's predominantly for the 40 men who still remain there, but it's also for all of us. Nelson Mandela had said, the oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity by places like Guantanamo. So it robs us of our humanity. I want to say a little bit about our culture and why the National Religious Campaign, which is a coalition of 300 faith organizations, an interfaith network, why we from day one have connected the disease, I will say, of anti-Muslim bigotry, which really stands at the root of so much of how this nation has responded to almost everything since in the post 9/11 environment. I want to say a word about why we have continued to speak about anti-Muslim bigotry while we're talking about closing and ending torture. It's a sad statement of our culture that terrorist is seen to equal Muslim. And the fear of terrorists is translated into fearing Muslims. And there is a huge multi-million-dollar industry that has come up around this to make sure that people are afraid of terrorists and are afraid of the, quote, Muslims who fit that category. And I'll tell a little story. I was part of a conference. It was a fairly large presentation, actually. I was on the stage with Imam Mohammed Musri, who was the head of the Islamic Center of Central Florida. And it was shortly after the Orlando nightclub shooting where someone who I believe just happened to be Muslim shot and killed almost 50 people in that nightclub. An act of terror for sure. But as we were sitting in the audience, and there were a lot of journalists there, and they kept asking Musri, okay, what now? What now? What are we going to do about terrorism? And I finally had to stop this. I said, hey, if you want to find somebody in the United States who's the next terrorist, you need to look for somebody who looks like me, not like a mom. And it wasn't popular. I got, I got. Well, I shouldn't laugh about it. I got death threats. I got all kinds of. My Facebook was blowing up. There was a lot of right-wing media. Oh, this guy's crazy. He's nuts. I was trying to make a point that if you are concerned about terrorism, or if you're concerned about violence of one human being against another inside this country, it's more than likely going to come from somebody who looks like me. We know that from the statistics of hate crimes. And then what happens? January 6th happens. And we see what happened at the Capitol of our own United States. We see the desecration, not a lone wolf actor like what happened in Florida with the Florida nightclub shooting, horrible as it was, a lone actor. This was well organized, well financed, well funded, and supported by the President of the United States. And it pained me a little bit that most of us in the advocacy community made a conscious decision not to call folks terrorists, and I don't like to call people terrorists anyway, but we had to do it because even after seeing all that, people still, if they hear the word terrorist, they think a Muslim must be involved. We need to root that out of our culture, and it is the #1 responsibility of the faith community, and I think it's very linked to trying to get Guantanamo closed, to make sure that anti-Muslim bigotry is once and for all rooted out of our culture. And that's a commitment and a strategy and a plan that NERCAT and so many other of our faith members, I think, are looking at now in working with our Muslim partners to just try to get the dialogue back to a level of basic human decency and normal human decency. It just affects so much, and it has such an impact on an issue like trying to get a place like Guantanamo closed. I want to say a word. Kathleen mentioned this too, but as long as we're talking about torture and people being imprisoned indefinitely, ICNA Social Justice Council and the National Religious Campaign Against Torture and many others across the faith community have taken this mandate to end torture and to close Guantanamo into what I see to be a related manifestation of the racism that also stands behind a place like Guantanamo. And we've taken our campaigns into the US prisons, where on any given year, anywhere from 60,000 to 80,000 people, mostly Black and brown people, are held in solitary confinement cells, held for months, years, sometimes even decades, where the United Nations has said that anyone who is held in these conditions for more than 15 days is now officially being tortured. And so there, the backdrop of torture in our own backyard is very much related because it is an issue of racial justice. I think somewhere around 10% of the people, 9 or 10% of the people that are in US prisons are Muslim, mostly I think because of African-American Muslim and conversions and other things. And it's an important population in the prisons. And we've been in the prisons with the Muslim chaplains, visiting the cells. And I'm not saying that that necessarily translates into how many people are in solitary confinement, but there again, people are being targeted by race, not so much religion, but certainly by race, and placed in situations of torture in the solitary confinement cells in this country. And I just need to mention that because I think it's got to be part of what we're addressing when we're looking at anything like Guantanamo, where torture is such a part of the history and such a big part of the moral mandate for why we need to do something about it. So I'd like to get to the questions, and so I'll just close a little bit. I think we need to keep Guantanamo in the forefront. As Lena mentioned at the beginning, this year is the 19th anniversary. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks here in September. I believe that if it wasn't for the faith community and many of the people that are on this webinar and others who aren't, but who work diligently on this day in and day out, I believe that Guantanamo would be forgotten and nobody would even know that it was there or what's happening. And so we've got to keep this in the forefront of the consciousness of this country in Washington, D.C. and in every state. We've got to keep taking our banners out there. We've got to keep out there. I see Richard Skrasinski, you mentioned there's a Just Security blog that you can look at. You can Google that, where Matt and I worked on really what are the steps that need to be taken by Congress and the administration to close this place. We need to educate our communities as well about why a place like Guantanamo never should have existed in the first place. But now, 19 years later, it is a moral abomination and it needs to be closed. Keep those finally who are being held there, and also all who are being held in solitary confinement cells. Keep them in your prayers, keep them in your hearts. They're suffering unimaginable situations to most of us. And the time is now to close Guantanamo. So I'll kick it back to Lena, and thanks everybody.
Thank you, Ron, for that. I think the last point you brought up is really important as to how this relates to the larger problem in U.S. prison populations. So if we could continue having questions in the chat come through, I think we'll start with some that have already been asked. So I think Kathy or Matt, either of you could answer this one. But there was a comment that mentioned how bounties were being paid to other governments, so it would seem as if the U.S. was doing something. Do either of you know anything about that, and could you elaborate upon it?
Well, I know that I've heard that when Musharraf was the head of Pakistan, that supposedly there was a $5,000 bounty that maybe he got, or that definitely there were $5,000 bounties that were being paid and that he was involved with it. But I don't know a lot of details. I don't know if you know more.
Yeah, and the bounties, I'll be honest, I started this work in 2007 and the bounties were mostly paid before that. But my understanding is that they were paid not just to governments, but to individuals. And the result was that there were a number of Guantanamo detainees who were essentially targeted by local enemies. And then it was a way to make money by getting rid of an enemy. You would tell the U.S. that they were Al-Qaeda, and you'd get paid some number of $1,000s, which is a good amount of money, even here, but it was more money there. And then your enemy would just disappear. And I mean, so, it's a terrible thing, but the result of that was there was a number of the 780 people in Guantanamo, as Kathy said, many of them pretty clearly in the end were innocent of any connection to Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban or other groups. And that was certainly a means by which a number of those pretty clearly innocent people ended up at Guantanamo.
Got it. Thank you. Do you think we could also maybe speak more on how other countries have used Guantanamo Bay as a justification to continue other human rights abuses? Some comments were speaking about that.
I mean, sure, I can jump in, and please feel free, anyone else, to add to it too. But two examples that spring to mind are that, so we're probably all aware of the rather terrible treatment in China of the Uyghurs, and the Chinese government has pointed to the U.S. treatment of Muslims post 9/11 as justification for, that's justification for that. Another example, though, too, was that we saw ISIS when they had control of a significant part of Syria and Iraq. One of the ways in which they brutalized people was by putting them in orange jumpsuits, clearly modeled after Guantanamo, and then beheading them. The reality is, it's not to say that China or ISIS would have done like good things in the absence of the U.S. example, but they both were clearly pointing to the U.S. example as look, they're just as bad as us, which undermines any attempt the U.S. makes to promote human rights.
I think Putin's also made statements pointing to what the U.S. has done to justify some of the stuff he's doing, and probably other governments as well.
And Lena, I'd even take it to the source, because I'm a United Church of Christ minister, and I was the director of the United Church of Christ office in Washington, D.C. when 9/11 happened, and the president of the denomination was in Germany at a conference, and we had other people in other parts of the world. And when 9/11 happened, there was this amazing outpouring of solidarity, of support, of extending the hand of friendship to the United States. This something terrible has happened. What can we do? How can we be part of this? And then immediately, when the U.S. response turned to torture, Guantanamo, rendition flights, picking people up and shipping them to secret prisons where they were being held for indefinitely and being tortured. And not all the news of that came out, but there was enough of it that began to happen that all of that goodwill was squandered. And once again, countries began to have to criticize the United States. I mean, there's always a lot to criticize the United States about, but it was one of those moments that we really squandered by instituting a place like Guantanamo, and we may never get that back. And for sure, I think we've all made the point that we're not going to get that back until we close Guantanamo.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. There was one more comment that was asking, what is a better and quicker way that we can do something rather than pushing Congress, and Congress is so slow and tedious these days?
Yeah, I don't mean to keep dominating the answers. I think that comment may have been directed to something I said and when I was speaking. So it's true, as the comment suggested, that that President Biden can either close Guantanamo or go a long ways towards closing Guantanamo without any assistance from Congress. Most of the at a minimum, most of the people who are there can be transferred out without Congress doing anything, by clearing them and then transferring to third countries, and by arranging for plea agreements that then detainees can be transferred to third countries, either to be released or to serve out a sentence in those countries when that's amenable to the detainee and both governments. Realistically, in my view, that is unlikely to happen for a very small number of detainees. Probably the 9/11, the 5 suspected of involvement in the 9/11 attacks, maybe one or two more. So most can leave the prison that way, and Biden should do that this year. Those small number after that, there is a legal argument that he can transfer them to the U.S. for trial and imprisonment, despite Congress having attempted to ban that. And we are advocating that his administration take that approach and agree with that legal argument. I don't know if his lawyers will ultimately conclude that is legal or not. That's the question. If they conclude it isn't, then Congress will probably have to act for those small number. Now, again, that's only a small number, and we should move everyone else out prior to that, irregardless of congressional action. But that's why I encourage people to reach out to Congress, because it may or may not become necessary depending where the Biden administration comes down on that. And just one more point too is that Congress is slow and tedious, but we do have a different Congress. It's been 10 years since we had a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic president. It is certainly possible now. I'm not saying it will happen, but it is certainly possible now that Congress will ease the restrictions on transferring people out of Guantanamo in a way that was not for the last decade. So I'm not saying Congress isn't slow and tedious, but if there's ever a time to push Congress and to hope for Congress to do the right thing, now is the time.
Mm-hmm. And someone else just asked, can the president issue an executive order to release the prisoners? And if so, why didn't Obama do that?
So President Obama did actually issue an executive order to close Guantanamo. The problem is it was implementing that. Just to be honest, President Obama did not put enough attention to the issue in the first 2 years when he had the most ability to do it. And after that, Congress had made it more difficult. President Biden hopefully will be aware of the potential difficulties. He may. There is actually rumor that he's going to do something on Guantanamo in the next month. So he may issue an executive order. He may. We don't know what that will be yet. But ultimately, it's not so much the ordering it closed. It's the details of getting plea agreements, of getting transfer agreements, etc., that need to happen, whether or not there's an executive order.
Kathy, maybe you can answer this question. You mentioned in your speech that Obama did not prosecute anyone for torture. What is the exact reason for that? Do you mind explaining that a little bit more?
Why he didn't?
Yeah, why he didn't.
Hang on, I'm getting a call. I have to okay. I mean, I think he just said something about wanting to look forward and not wanting to look back, and didn't want to deal with it and wanted unity. But that was a big mistake, because it's impunity for torture. I mean, that's about the worst thing you can do. And to just allow that to happen and allow Cheney to brag about it and write a book about it and be proud of it is just totally not okay. And I don't know if they can do anything about it now, but that was a huge mistake, I think.
Got it. We had another comment. How will a federal ban on the death penalty affect the Guantanamo Bay prisoners? I'm not sure if any of you would know.
I mean, it depends on what Congress says, or if it's Congress that does that. If there's a decision by DOJ not to go forward with the death penalty in the federal cases, as had been the case for quite a while, and then Trump tried to execute as many people as possible before leaving office, I think that wouldn't affect the military commission people. That's a separate military system. So there would have to be, I think, Congress or some decision by the military not to use it in the military system, and it would be different. So I don't know.
So we have one more question. How can I get a list of prisoners by imprisonment category, like cleared or release, indefinite detention? Are there any resources for anything like that any of you know about?
The New York Times, there's a few, well, you guys probably know more, but I know the New York Times has a list of the people still there and what category they're in, and then there's other groups that do as well.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to that is there's a reporter who used to work for the Miami Herald, now works for the New York Times, Carol Rosenberg, who is, I mean, honestly, she might be the most expert on Guantanamo out there as a broadly speaking, as an issue. So if you're interested in more information, I encourage you to follow her reporting.
And Lena, one other comment that's out there is about the role of cultural workers and artists, exposing this. And the trailer to the Martanian, I think, shows that there is, there's more than us who are concerned about this issue. And I know the National Religious Campaign Against Torture and others sponsored a campaign last year around a film called The Report, which was around the production of the torture report by the Senate Intelligence Committee, and then the fight to get the executive summary of it released. And that had to do, I think, with accountability, which we were talking about earlier, about trying to hold people accountable for the crimes of torture that they really committed. And there were a number of the Guantanamo detainees that were listed in that report. So the faith community did a good job, I think, at that point of getting that out. I spoke at a number of screenings. I know others probably on this call and elsewhere held screenings of that and spoke. And I think as we see our cultural icons and actors, and that one, the report had Adam Driver in it, and I always say that might bring a newer generation to this issue, the younger generation, as we see them stepping out to speak out really against torture and to close Guantanamo. We really need to support that and do what we can to make sure that our faith communities see these movies, and then NEARCAT and other organizations have really good resources and study guides if you want to show films about this, about things that you can ask in your cultural context, in your faith community, to really get other people to start to understand the issue a little bit more deeply, and then hopefully take action.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. I think that's definitely true. There needs to be cross collaboration and just like moving along the spectrum of different faith-based communities, different professionals to try to get something finally done. I just wanted to thank all the speakers again for joining us. We're going to play another video now, but I hope that everyone in the comments and all the speakers as well, that we continue being very on top of the issue and hopefully continue collaborating in the future.
Yeah, so I'll introduce our closing song. Some of you may have seen it. Our friends, the Interfaith Communities United for Justice and Peace in Los Angeles, which I stop in on them once in a while when I'm in California. They meet every Friday at 7:30 a.m. and closing Guantanamo has been one of their priorities for years. They've done a lot of street theater. They've taken banners. They've held vigils. They've supported campaigns when the religious community needs to speak out. A couple of the folks in their network took the song Guantanamero and turned it into and actually I think they debuted it at a street protest that they were in to close Guantanamo. They turned it into a song and it's a very uplifting song about all of us working together to close Guantanamo. So here it is.
Guantanamera, Guajira Guantanamera, Guantanamera, Guajira Guantanamera. On this beautiful island, where the shore meets the shimmering sea, there is a nightmare upon us, a deep plague on our humanity, a house of torture, of cruelty and pain, which every day brings the USA shame. We've got to close Guantanamo. We've got to close Guantanamo. Close Guantanamo. We've got to close Guantanamo.
Detainees held without charges in a legal black hole to plead for their flight, locked in indefinite detention in violation of all human rights,
in violation of international law, in violation of all conventions of war. We've got to close Guantanamo. We've got to close Guantanamo. Close Guantanamo. We've got to close Guantanamo. $2.7 million per detainee, $454 million cost annually. Taxpayers built for the spending to see the war machine run without ending, only making our longest war longer, only inciting the hate to get stronger. We've got to close Guantanamo. We've got to close Guantanamo. Close Guantanamo. We've got to close Guantanamo. We've got to close Guantanamo. We've got to close Guantanamo. Close Guantanamo. We've got to close Guantanamo.
So, brothers and sisters, we are gathered here today inspired by the hope of freedom for the 155 men that are still imprisoned in Guantanamo.
Thanks, everyone. I think we are finished with the presentation. It will be available to share. And Lena, if you have any closing words,
Yeah.
it's all yours.
No, thank you everyone for joining. I hope that you benefited from the discussion, and hopefully we can continue speaking about Guantanamo Bay until it is hopefully closed soon. Thank you.